I want to welcome you all. We're really delighted to have our speaker, Jodie Geddes, with us tonight, as well as all of you. We are so glad you could join us for this, which is our first session of the St. Anselm's 2021 Lenten Series. I'm Marian Mulkey, and I'm the co-chair of our Parish Christian Formation Commission. St. Anselm's has a long tradition of bringing people together for fellowship and learning during Lent, which is the period leading up to Easter. In normal years, we invite people to gather in our fellowship hall, and we have soup and salad, and we have conversations and speakers, and really enjoy both the fellowship and the presentations. This year, obviously, is different, and we're doing this in this Zoom format, which has some downsides: no soup, no salad, but it has the upside of being able to really welcome and expand our network to friends and friends of friends, and folks who might not be able to or be inclined to find the small street in Lafayette where our church is located. So glad to have you all with us, and hope that you will find it, as we expect to, a really meaningful evening and series. So over the years in these Lenten series, we have covered a lot of diverse topics. We're kind of an eclectic group, and a lot of us like to learn about a lot of topics. We've talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We've talked about an exploration of Islam. We've focused series on gender and sexual identity, and on race and ethnicity. But a common theme from year to year has been this set of questions about what defines community, and how do we advance and build community. Another way to say that might be, who is my neighbor? How is it that we as an individuals and a community of faith understand and engage across differences, or across the characteristics that people tell us make us different, whether they're true or not. Another bit of context for this series is that last summer and fall, St. Anselm sponsored a 10-session series from the National Episcopal Church called Sacred Ground. And that series is a deep dive into this country's and the Episcopal Church's troubled history around race and racism. A number of the people on this call spent some time really learning history and grappling with experiences and facts that we maybe didn't understand as well as we should have long ago. Toward the end of that session, we were introduced through documentaries and materials some of the history of restorative justice practices, the links to the Native American traditions, and some examples of the current use of restorative justice in various places around the country. This kind of piqued our curiosity about what might be going around closer to our neighborhood and community in this domain. And so it emerged that we developed this series to look at what some of the local leaders and community-based organizations are doing with restorative justice practices. So that's the theme of this year's Lenten series. That's how we got to this night. And we are really thrilled to be here, to have you all with us, and to be able to share from organizations that we might not, in, again, our corner of Lafayette, otherwise encounter. So tonight, Jodie Geddes, who is, as you can see if you have her thumbnail up, a parent of a young child, is going to be our speaker. But before we turn it over to her, she's asked that we share a short video. So I will do that, and I will, and it will take me just a minute when I set that up for us to do the screen sharing and to get that all in place. So we're going to share a video, which is about 10 minutes long. After the video, Jodie's going to speak for about a half hour, followed by questions and answers. I'm going to ask you to keep yourself muted, and to the extent that you can, submit your questions via the chat function in Zoom. And either I'll call on you or I'll try to represent your question appropriately so we can kind of keep the flow going. So that's our plan for tonight. Before I show the video, does anybody have any questions or concerns or comments? And the other thing I should say is we do fully expect to be done by 8:30, and that's our plan. Okay, I am now going to do that magic thing where I show a video, I think. Uh-oh, that was not right. Sorry, guys.
All eyes was on me. I was like sweating in the hands and stuff. I was like nervous. My mom and my dad was there. It made me feel like walking out the damn room. That's what it made me feel like, dude. I feel like just canceling this and be like, nah, I'm good. It was too much attention.
If you go back in your browser, you'll be able to locate the other video since it's on autoplay. So if on your browser you go back. This is also a great video, everyone.
I'm
like
sorry,
sweating
folks.
in the hands and
It's
stuff.
okay.
Okay, we're gonna pause. I'm gonna get my act together. I had it together once, but then I stopped having it together. Okay. There we go.
As you're getting it together, go ahead.
Coming for what?
And then the circle and their relationships with each other actually kind of like quiet something in them and allow them to be more present for each other.
When we do circles here, before we do the circles, we sit down and like plan the opening ceremony. My great hope is to laugh as much as I cry, to get my work done and try to love someone. And I have enough courage to accept the love in return. Maya Angelou. And in high school especially, like, we don't have enough, connections with each other sometimes, everybody just all focused on the work and, stress at home and stuff like that. And circles create a space where people can talk about their feelings, about how they're doing home life. Now we will review our class values. The first one was being open.
The other one is respect.
We share our values to respect each other and stuff like that because, we all are still humans and people get sensitive sometimes. So we're trying to make sure, that everybody feels comfortable and doesn't get their feelings hurt. Okay, now we will share an object that relates to hope.
I have my I Heart Being Black bracelet because I hope that everybody is proud of who they are.
I got this play to win thing from a boyfriend, and we exchange bands all the time. And this brings hope because, it just keeps me going.
My mom made this necklace for me, and it represents hope because she never had time to do anything for herself. They're being asked to be vulnerable to a group of people, which is kind of like antithetical to what it's like to be a teenager, which is what's the best way to hide right now. So the first thing that I do is I share as deeply as I possibly can. I feel like if I can share deeply and from my heart and listen really attentively to other students, they're looking at me to see how I'm behaving.
I have you guys give me a lot of hope and stuff like that. Our advisory is like a family. I've been through police brutality, tragedies and stuff like that. And instead of me being depressed about life, I know I can come in and talk to my community. They understand. And most of the time, if it's something I'm going through, they've probably already been through it before.
people act like they shy and stuff like that, you know, and like the icebreaker loosens and, you know, everybody up, you know, y'all get in a good mood and then we're ready to talk.
The wind comes and blows if you live in Oakland.
The wind comes and takes anyone whose shirt is black.
The wind comes and takes anyone that likes to play basketball.
Anybody who has headphones.
Anybody that lives in East Oakland. If you're wearing shorts. The wind comes and
Blows if
you have on a pink shirt. I picked this talking piece. This show is hard, and we're a strong community.
It's kind of like step up, step back, because, you know, I am stepping up by, you know, putting myself out there and being a facilitator. But I'm also like stepping back because I'm letting other people talk as well.
What's good about being a teenager?
You get more freedom now.
You get to know people really deeply.
if you look back on your childhood, you realize that there's certain things that you couldn't do when you were that age.
You get the taste of being an adult.
Man.
So, yeah, you're like.
I mean, I find it balanced to be serious and be funny. If we're saying something that's, you know, sad, that just changes the whole direction of the circle. So, I mean, eventually somebody has to say something to make the circle, you know, bring back to life, because if it's sad, nobody's going to want to talk again.
And sort of like letting the circle alternate between serious and light. We can laugh in certain moments. We can allow this to become lighter so that we also stay more resilient in the circle. And laughing with them is really important. And it also shows I respect all of who they are.
What's hard about being a teenager?
Sometimes you just want to do stuff that you think you're ready for, but then when really you're not, and you just want to grow up too fast sometimes.
When you're a child, you know how you're always so happy and stuff like that. Now you're a teenager and you know what stuff's happening in the world, and like you feel sadder. I don't remember being happy. Like the closest time I remember that was when I was like 6. So the one thing I hate about being a teenager is like you can't be as happy as you were as a kid.
I remember really wanting to leave home from really the time I started high school. I had to just like sit with it and wait until I was old enough to leave the house, even though I wasn't necessarily ready.
I have more responsibilities now. Take care of my little brother and family members and everything, so it's really harder now.
You have to learn how to say things without getting in trouble, or like the right way how to say it without like getting an attitude.
Before I came to Midwest, I didn't have no self-control. Like in class, I was the class clown, like, and I never listened to my teachers. Getting suspended, I never cared. And every time I got a phone call home, I used to lie and say, she lying, I never did that. When I'm in a circle, I feel opened up. The circles is a part of me treating people better because I see how people are when people open up, and I see how they're treated, and I know I wouldn't want nobody to treat me like that.
They come into the room with 9 years of experience of this is what kind of student I am. And I just think that's the power of a circle. You are exactly who you are as you are in relationships with your peers. Someone who she doesn't get to be most of the time.
You can control yourself. You don't need nobody to tell you to stop. You know if you right or wrong.
If you could change one thing about being a teenager, what would it be?
Everyone should have a mentor, not only about your schoolwork, but like what goes on in your house.
They're wondering why teenagers are like becoming more and more obese, and it's because they don't feed us healthier foods.
School should be more interactive because the best way to learn is hands-on.
They still see us like we're little kids, but they don't know what's going on in our minds. They don't know if we're maturing. What are the things teenagers can do to make a difference in their lives or others?
Think about things twice before you do anything. That was my lesson learned. Because if I would have thought about it the second time, I've probably never been in the trouble I'm in.
Don't be so negative. Once you're negative around people, like people get negative too. If you're positive, then everybody around you going to be more positive, even if they're around, like their household is negative.
Her ability to build relationships with her peers, to allow me to know her more deeply, to allow other people to help harness her energy of this is the kind of student I am, I think it's allowed her to stay here.
So we're going to do the closing ceremony. Because you have an opening one, so why not have a closing one? I mean, you know, like, you have to close it out with something good. this little basket is gonna go around. Everybody will pick a name, and then you say appreciation.
I want to appreciate Alfredo because you're hella nice.
I appreciate Matthew. You're a good friend, and I know I can trust you with stuff.
I want to appreciate you because you're really nice and you're really fun to hang out with, and you did a good job leading this.
I appreciate Sarah because this whole week and last week, Sarah's just been making me laugh, and like she just got a good attitude, and she's like so helpful. She helps me whenever I need help. I see her like a sister.
I want to appreciate Pancho for staying strong after going through a lot and having to wear that and being under house arrest and not being able to go out.
I want to appreciate you because on everything you do, you always give it like 120%. And like you really just express yourself in everything you do. And yeah, best friend.
Everybody clap for Kalia and Jennifer and yourselves. Yeah.
All right. So I hope that was a helpful and accessible entree to those who have joined during that video. Welcome. I do just want to let you know pardon me. All right. All right. Sorry about that. So I want to turn it over to Jodie now, who's going to give a little context for that video, and will present some remarks about her organization, her work, and the impact that it's had on people and schools and community. Thank you, Jodie, for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's good to be here with you all right now and to talk about the work that I'm led to do and the person I'm led to be. My name is Jodie Geddes. I am the Healing Services Manager with Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. And I also help to coordinate our national truth-telling and restorative justice work, really looking at envisioning a national truth and reconciliation process for the United States, examining violence against African Americans and folks across the diaspora. So I do many things at the organization. For us as an organization, everything is grounded in anti-racist, anti-bias practices. So not just about how do we build deep and strong, authentic relationships, also how do we challenge and shift and transform systems that impact our relationships with each other. And so we do those things simultaneously through the practice of restorative justice. Earlier, you kind of heard about the indigenous piece of restorative justice. Before I kind of get into the wider pieces, I'm gonna name that this video I wanted to show to really show you what circle looks like when I say circle. I know sometimes it's hard for folks to envision if they've never been in a space, but that's exactly what it is. Not just young people. I think young people often make people feel inspired though when they watch a video of young people doing this work, but age really doesn't matter when we're able to come together and sit in space. And so when I talk about kind of the physical elements in a lot of our systems and structures impact our ability to be in relationship with each other. And so when you think about sitting across from someone and having a difficult conversation, it often feels very different than maybe sitting around in a circle. Not necessarily for everyone, but we believe that folks want to be connected to each other. And even the structure of circle transforms and shifts how we connect. And then, so an example of that is prisons and jails, right? Often folks who are justice involved or incarcerated can be an afterthought. And we saw that in this COVID-19 pandemic, that folks who are incarcerated is an afterthought. And one reason for that is the actual structural pieces where prisons and jails tend to be far away. So it is often not visible, right? And so it's not something where there's a constant engagement unless someone's maybe personal experience, story, or something leads them for that to be something that's in the forefront of their mind. And very much a lot of that is done when we think about our history of enslavement, Jim Crow, and so many other structures in our society. And so those are some of the same things I talk about, even how the structure of the circle informs how we can be in relationship with each other. And a lot of our work started in schools. And so in Oakland Unified School District, after really confronting the realities of systemic racism, even in somewhere like Oakland with a deep and thriving history, and I think just across the Bay Area, recognizing that young people, particularly Black and brown youth, were being expelled at an alarming rate as well as suspended. And there was something that needed to be done about that. And what was beautiful about this community, and I'm not originally from here, is that folks decided to institute long-term solutions to this issue, right? So they implemented, and this was about 2005, 2007, a pilot restorative justice program, and saw incredible results of just 0% expulsion and a drop in about 89% suspension, right? So there were these great things happening, but also increased young people's participation in the classroom and some other things when we think about community, as well as their engagement with school, right? What we're really seeing is a cultural shift to restorative justice and not just punitive ways of being. A lot of folks come to understand restorative justice only in the context of harm. And it's really important to push back against that, to recognize that the more, I believe, at least in my organization, Our Joy believes, the more deeply we're in relationship with each other, when harm happens, we're less likely to make each other disposable, right? So if I just met someone second day, you say something I don't like, quite frankly, we don't have that proximity. It's a little bit easier for me to say, you don't matter, whatever, we never have to talk again, versus someone maybe we've invested months or even years into a relationship. And it's not necessarily inherent, I'm making an assumption, right? But what we believe is when we talk about a cultural shift, how do we create a foundation for building relationships so that when harm happens or conflict happens, because they're not always the same thing, or disagreement, we don't agree on something, when that happens, I can lean into that with accountability and also acknowledge someone's full humanity and dignity. And that is often something that is challenging to do in a structure of systemic and racism and violence that puts everything in a dichotomy. It's Black or white, this or that, good or bad, good or evil. There is no spectrum for these things. And so restorative justice really creates a container in when we talk about even harm or just disagreement, conflict, whatever it is, where we shame the act and not the person. So we can see someone's full humanity and dignity and yet still talk about accountability. Accountability just looks different, right? As a community, we begin to decide what accountability looks like. And that's a way that we also transform systems that laws are inherently often racist and violent against particular groups of people. And so for us, really, restorative justice, or at least me, it's this practice of remembering Afrocentric and Indigenous ways of healing and being together, recognizing that our system looks different from that with colonization and systemic racism. And yet, how do we center relationships to help inform how we are able to transform systems? And I know that I just said a lot of that, and I'll identify some different ways that folks are engaging in restorative justice, even when they are not sitting in a circle process, right? Because there's circle process, and then there's this practice and philosophy of restorative justice. And so, for example, colleges and universities are really thinking about how to engage in restorative justice as a part of their kind of culture and climate. So in combination with that, they might have anti-racist or undoing racism workshops. They also have shifted sometimes their judicial policies to be of restorative justice. So maybe instead of a point system, folks are coming into it sitting in a circle where you often get to the root of it. I think about my undergrad as a student advocate, I engage in restorative justice practices. And through that, a substance abuse group was actually created on campus because we were realizing someone might, in theory, break a policy around drinking, right? Whether or not you saw them drink, there was a bottle, something, right? And then through having a deeper conversation to say, how did this harm you? How did this impact the community, those habits impact the community, and also how do we create a plan to move forward? And of course, the plan looked different from everyone else for each individual person, but it definitely alluded that there's some other systemic things that are happening. And I think many college campuses would recognize that same thing as well. Another place where folks are really engaging in restorative justice, where it's even more challenging, is particularly around policing. New Zealand is really well known for this. They have really pushed to think about what are the indigenous ways that restorative justice can show up. And so their police officers, for example, kind of act like social workers. So they approach situations like social workers. That's something that we see us exploring in the United States as well, when we talk about the role of mental health practitioners and counselors, work teams working with folks who are engaging in policing practices. And so folks approach situations many ways like counselors, which impacts the escalation or de-escalation of a particular situation, right? And so, and they actually had a law that was specifically around family and children, right? So how do you institute restorative justice? Sometimes it looks like a law that put mandates in place to say, not necessarily what is right or wrong, but that there is another way, instead of continuing to repeat these harmful practices. When we look at the trends in who's being incarcerated and at what rate, it is telling us there is something that's wrong here. And how do we look back to bring it into the space that we are today? And you know, Harrisonburg Police Department, for example, in Virginia, has done a lot of restorative justice training. I've helped to train officers, the same thing in New York and many other places. So that's, you know, in schools, in policing, on college campuses, yeah, as well as in judicial systems. In Alameda County, there is an organization called Community Works West. They also have an office in San Francisco where cases that involve young people are diverted to them through a restorative conferencing model. And so there's community building circle, and there are many other models where young person would not be incarcerated and on this path, you know, the school to prison pipeline path, but they would still, one, have to take accountability in this process. I think sometimes folks make an assumption that accountability, that, you know, kind of punitive equates to accountability, and there are other ways accountability can be present without it being punitive, according to our philosophy of restorative justice. And so through that process, folks are still taking accountability, and they're developing a plan to say, how do we move forward? And they're often people who support the plan for moving forward. And so the video that we started playing by accident actually shows what's called a welcome circle of a young man who was incarcerated and then coming into a new school, and they had a welcome circle. When you think about adults, or quite frankly, anyone who's incarcerated, there isn't really a reintegration process. Here's a bus pass, maybe a few bucks. You've been incarcerated for 15 years, go out into the world, right? Like there isn't a wraparound, excuse me a second, come on. There isn't a wraparound process that really helps someone engage. What we have is a system that continues to punish and harm. And so restorative justice, you know, is really about asking the question of what are the needs and obligations? And it also expands a circle of who needs to be in the process, right? We know that when harm happens and when conflict happens, there are ripples, right? And how do we bring in those other folks who have maybe been impacted? And that's particularly when it comes to conflict, because that's a context that folks know it through. I really stress, and Ardroy really stress, how do we do the preventative piece, right? That shouldn't be the only time that someone is engaging in the practice or engaging in even thinking and dreaming about healing or even receiving the support that they need. We recognize sometimes when a lot of folks are incarcerated, it might be the first time they're having access to things like healthcare or education, which is a deep-seated issue in our country. And so how do we, beforehand, thinking about building a restorative culture, we're in community, you're understanding your feelings, that's okay, where we're in community and really building deep relationship with each other. And so there are many different things that go into that. All of our work is really grounded with that anti-racist, anti-bias lens, even in our truth-telling, racial healing and reparations work, really thinking about what does a restorative city look like? And we've been dreaming and visioning about that in Oakland for a few years now. And there are 2 other places where Restorative City actually does exist, where they've really thought through what does restorative justice look like in healthcare, for example. How do we talk about restorative justice in healthcare, restorative justice in education, restorative justice in housing, restorative justice in economics, really thinking about what does a healed society and world look like? What does a liberated society and world look like? And it will look different for all of us. And also centering the dignity and humanity of everyone in that, like the inherent dignity and humanity, not one that someone has to get through some kind of policy or law, which we've seen because of the history of this country. And I know that I just said a lot, so I'm actually gonna pause there to give you a moment to reflect. I'm a New Yorker, so I may have also talked really fast. I'm trying to pay attention to that, to just kind of ask any questions and see what thoughts are coming up. Am I headed in the right direction?
You're doing great, Jodie, and we really, really appreciate it. And thank you also for the pause. So let me ask a couple of questions. One's just a really concrete one about the programs and activities that Our Joy is involved in, particularly in schools, like how many schools, what level schools, but also other work that you're doing with youth and with others that maybe would just give us an overview of your organization and its work.
So at one point we had over 40 coordinators. That doesn't exist anymore. Oakland Unified School District, they actually have their separate arm of restorative justice. So there is a restorative justice office. Right now, there has been a shift in the number of coordinators because of budget cuts. And so we are really dreaming and visioning what Oakland Unified School District, as well as the restorative justice office, to think about, like, what does funding look like outside of capitalism, where programs that folks want don't get cut first. There were a lot of school board meetings that actually young people rallied around and shut down as they were talking about taking away kind of restorative justice coordinators and other fields. And so the number has decreased. What happened is, because Oakland Unified School District was after the kind of pilot program, they were able to build up their own infrastructure. So we didn't need to micromanage that. So they were over time able to hire coordinators. There are folks who are currently Our Joy staff that do our restorative justice in schools work, supporting other folks who want to implement restorative justice in their schools. And these are folks who were coordinators for a long time in school. So there are folks on our staff who support other school districts. So for example, we've worked with Madera School District for over 3 years now, Occidental College. We do a lot of contracting work with folks who want to implement restorative justice, even places in New York, a lot of schools even throughout the Bay that might not have restorative justice. So the program has shifted. So the numbers have drastically decreased over the last year. I think one, because of COVID, but the reality of the budget cuts in Oakland Unified School District. But they have an office that continues to provide training for restorative justice coordinators, as well as teachers and other folks who would like to be trained. So that's one. And then the other piece, don't stop touching it. That's why that keeps coming off. The other piece is we provide different weekly circles. Our circles center African American healing. A lot of that is through our work with behavioral health. So we have a Sister Cypher Circle, Black Women's Circle, Black Men's Circle, Black and Brown Unity Circle, Queer and Trans People of Color Circle, a youth circle for teens, and a middle school age circle, educators circle for folks in education across the spectrum. And there's probably one or two I'm forgetting. We are going to be starting a circle for folks who identify as white and allies and accomplices, or folks of European descent. We've done a lot of that work already with coordinators in Oakland Unified School District who identify as people of European descent, to really think about, yeah, you all see this behind it, to really think about their racial identity in relationship to the work that they do in schools, especially in Oakland. And so we provide weekly restorative justice circles. We also provide free community trainings. We're going to be doing a lot of that throughout the year. We also provide free community events where there might be a film and a discussion, or a panel and discussion. And so that's a wide range. And then of course the consulting work. A lot of my work is also with faith communities. So I've done a lot of trainings and discussions over the years with Allen Temple, for example, as well as First Congregational and the organization Genesis out of the Gamaliel Network. We are a member of their organization. And so our work is a wide spectrum. It's really asking, where are we called to serve, and then how do we show up in that capacity, doing what we do best. Was that helpful for you?
That was very helpful. And I really, so what I hear you doing is that some of it is direct service and hands-on management of circles, and some of it is more of a consulting role where you provide expertise and let other people run the circles and do the work. So one question that we've got is, in a school setting, as was shown in the video, how do kids find themselves in that setting? Do they select in? Do they raise their hand and say, I want to be part of that? Or is there some predicate in terms of behavior or other things that brings them to that place?
Yeah, it's a yes and. So some schools have advisory. I think advisory is the same thing as homeroom, where there's a moment before your regular schedule starts. And so that video you actually saw was their advisory. So they were meeting over a course of time and doing that process. And then some folks, the class is an elective, so they can choose to take restorative justice. And it's done in circles. So it's still, they're learning about it, and it's also through this experiential way. And then some other school communities, there are circles that are built in other ways, either around tough conversations, but definitely around their punitive policies. A lot of schools, not all, if I'm being honest, but a lot of schools have replaced kind of suspension and expulsion with the restorative justice process on all levels, both around relationship building, when conflict and harm might happen, and then the welcome and reentry when someone may be been out for whatever reason it is. And even in the schools where they still have suspension, although I'm like, you shouldn't have it, they still have it, they can still hold a circle as someone comes back in to the school community. So we think about, what does welcome and reintegration look like, as well as support. So we can hold you accountable, and we also need to be able to provide support. Yeah, so that's kind of the different ways.
Okay. Thank you. So, I'm getting lots of questions, and thank you all who are submitting questions. I'm going to come back to a few of them. But I just wanted to offer the observation. I just really appreciated the video and some of your remarks about how it seems like a lot of this is a toolbox for skills, for communication skills and relationship building skills that would serve almost anybody well across their whole life. And it seems like you're really trying to bring about sort of a cultural shift at crucial moments in people's lives to have the tools they need to heal or be healed. Is that kind of a fair observation? Yeah. How, well, put it in your words.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that.
What is it that you are, what problem are you solving? What is it that you're fixing or making better, restoring with restorative justice?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And I would also say not just a culture shift for people's lives, but the world, right? Yeah. Like the world and the actual systems and structures that impact people's lives, right? So even when we talk about restorative economics, like where are the places in like systems and structures that inhibit people to even gain things like wealth, right? Like, let's just be clear, like there's a whole historical narrative around that, right? And even when we talk about restorative economics, what does it mean to provide skills, foundations, practices, services, access to things like loans, even expungement of records? When we think about the legalization of marijuana, and folks are still incarcerated because of racist practices that led to them being incarcerated, and yet there has been no repair. So how do we talk about like access to folks accessing wealth, which a lot of these policies name, and yet there's no repair for the harms in which the previous policies have already perpetuated and impacted people, right? So I think, yes, in one's own life, okay, great. I think in one's own life, and I think also, how do we shift the systems that directly impact one's life, which is why when we go into a school, and this is a long drawn out explanation, but often when we go into a school and folks say, we want to do conflict circle, or we're like, okay, but you don't want to build any relationships. So folks' only experience of restorative justice is doing to rather than doing with. So anything that's great can always turn into something that ain't so good, right? And so even with restorative justice, you can still send all the Black and brown young people to the restorative justice room, and then you begin to do to rather than with, which is why we talk about the culture shift. So you're being with folks. And it doesn't mean restorative justice is going to solve anything, but the more that we're able to, in some ways, understand each other, it does help when there are moments of disagreement. And even if there's no disagreement, how do we just be in deep relationship and community with each other. And so I think for me, yes, the kind of cultural shift in like in one's own life, and also in terms of system, I see that I know you're doing the question, I see there's a question around what is non-punitive accountability. Yeah, so I think what is some of the, at least for me, what I see as the issue with punitive accountability is that it shames a person, right? So I committed an act, I did something, now I'm a bad person. Brian Stevenson talks about how someone begins to be defined by the worst thing that they've ever done. And kind of punitive accountability does that, right? And, you know, someone commits a harm in terms of like breaks a law, right? Someone commits a harm, they incarcerated, they serve their time, they come out and then begin to be defined by the worst thing that they've ever done, although they've served their time according to this law and policy, right? And that, you know, there are so many other things that define who people are and who they show up as in the world, right? And so, are you okay? She's having a moment. Mama, you're okay. It's right here. I don't know why the sound isn't on. Maybe you press something. So I think, so for when we talk about restorative justice and accountability, let's say in the context of like a harm, because I know that's what we're talking about, right? Let's say someone comes to our organization and they don't want to go to the police or wherever, and they say they want a restorative circle, right? Usually what happens in what is seen as our punitive system, a law is broken, who did it, and how do we give them what they deserve, right? It doesn't actually talk about the person who may have been impacted, right? And then there's all this residue that's left behind, right? Hurt people. There's all this residue that's left behind that is never addressed. Even in restorative justice in its kind of contemporary times centers the person who has been harmed, right? Our system of punitive harm and punishment doesn't center folks who have been harmed. For example, victim impact statements don't have to be read in the court by law. So like, here's this person that's been harmed, right? And the state is enacting what that person deserves, even without input from the harmed party, who may not in fact want that, right? Nor does it bring in the other parties in which the residue of harm is left behind. How does it impact the community? How does it impact the family? All of these ripples. And so when we talk about restorative justice, we increase the table of stakeholders. And so, you know, in harm circles I've done before, we may have had a supporting party, we may have had a family, we may have had a friend, we may have had a partner. You're bringing in other people, but in a conflict circle specifically, not community building, there is a part where you talk about a plan. What is the plan for repair? And as a holder of space, I can't name what that plan is for repair. Sometimes folks have said, I need an apology. Sometimes folks have said, like, you need to pay me back. Like, I need some money, right? Like, we discuss, and of course, like, we can't always get what we dream of, but what it gives is folks who have been harmed and impacted the ability, usually for the first time in their lives, to name what their needs are and what repair looks like for them. And once again, to name, I don't think that restorative justice can fit for everything, but how do we work towards being in proximate relationship with each other? And so sometimes often folks say, you know, restorative justice is too soft on crime. Folks have to admit accountability. You don't enter into a circle process without admitting accountability, right? So even that, it's hard. A lot of folks would say, I would have rather just received a sentence than having to admit accountability to this thing that I did, because in our judicial system, you don't have to. And of course, that looks different when we're talking about a community building circle, or it looks different in a school. A lot of it is creating space for the community to decide what the needs are and obligations are. Because what I might think as even a circle keeper might not be what people need or what they want. Sometimes I've helped people prep for a process for more than 6 hours. We never had the process because the prep was enough for their healing. You know, so I could have assumed like you need to say to the person, you need to be in space, and they're like, oh, I'm good. There's so much around when there's trauma that never gets unpacked, right? And then folks live it out, and then hurt people. And it doesn't mean that everyone is a traumatized being and people are broken and need to be fixed, but there's usually not space for the body to even respond to a thing that might happen to someone. It's like, this thing happened, now you get up and you move on. That was a long explanation again, as I usually tend to do. I hope that was helpful, but it's really about just bringing people together to decide what their needs and obligations are. Yeah.
So again, I'm really in awe of your multitasking as well as your ability to share so much information in this context, Jodie. So let me try again to get a little bit more concrete about maybe a school setting. So this group is not young, and so I'm going to date myself by imagining situations where in a school setting that I might have known about or my kids might have known about, a kid misbehaved, disrupted class, made it impossible for the teacher and the kids, some of the other kids in the class, to engage in what we would consider to be normal curriculum lesson. So the go-to sort of more punitive thing is get that kid out of there, suspend him, send him home for 2 weeks, expel him. He can't come to school here anymore, which isolates him, takes him away, doesn't necessarily fix the issue of classroom management and effective learning. So in a restorative practice, am I correct that you would do more to actually talk with the community at large? What should we do about this kid who, how did that affect you, other students in the classroom? What did that feel like to you, teacher? Why did you do that, person who caused the disruption? So it's not so much punitive. Somehow, if we get you out of here or call you bad, that will fix it. It's rather trying to figure out what the underlying causes and harms are and do something about it. Is that?
Yeah, and I would also say language is so important, right? Like, what did you do, right? Or like, what happened is very much different than like, why did you do that, right?
Yes.
Because even then, like, all of us can see and witness something and have different perspectives on it. And so once again, it's like shaming the act and not shaming the person, right? What happens is then folks take on that whole thing, like, I'm a bad person, I'm terrible. And even in those situations, when we talk about a restorative culture, that even the teacher would be able to engage with that young person in a way that de-escalates the situation rather than maybe even escalates it, because not because maybe they inherently have those skills, but they've been taught and have those practices and tools. And even their classroom is a container of safety. Like, I've been in classrooms before where students have cussed me out and I'm like, okay, I recognize that there is a response and it's coming from somewhere else. It's not necessarily about me, right? And in those moments, I'm like, okay, I'll let you keep going, pause. And I'm like, do you need a minute? Folks are often like, you didn't say anything. And these are schools, of course, that didn't have restorative justice. And I would say, do you need a moment? All right, you can go outside, get a moment. You can keep doing whatever it is that you need to do. Like, your body needs to release something. And it does, in some ways, I might not like that you're cussing me out, but how do I then help to support you to be able to articulate what it is that you're feeling in those moments, right? Even if it doesn't look like maybe the way that I'm going to respond, rather than being like, you're terrible, you hate school, why are you even here? And then it just like literally all of that is escalating the situation in my role, and I'm also thinking particularly like in my role as a teacher. And so we want to be able to create a container, and of course there's no perfection, right? Create a container, and even like some classrooms begin to even build like a language around these things. I think about when I used to do work, like understanding restorative justice workshops with young people, I used to do this flip your lid model that they use a lot around trauma-informed practices. And I used to be like, where's your lid today? I know someone's right here, they're ready to tip. I know to think more carefully about how I engage with you. And maybe after class, I can check in to say, how are you feeling? What's going on? Do you want to talk about it? It's okay if you don't, but I'm creating a container just to say how you're doing. What happens is there's an expectation for young people to leave all of who they are at the door and to just be a student. And you hear the teacher talk about that in the video. There's these 9 years of this is the type of student you are, right? This circle says, or even this process or cultural shift says, this is the type of human you are. And also we can see the human that you want to be, right? And so I think that piece is also really important. Also, it doesn't mean that sometimes people don't need to be taken out of community. The question is what happens when they come back? I've done some restorative justice cases that have been really high profile, have been like very, very, very serious. And sometimes those folks, we did the process, but we talked about, like, you don't need to be in community, and as a group decided on a plan. How long are you going to be out of community? What is phase 1 of integration? What is phase 2? What is phase 3? And we had to talk about those things real seriously, but recognizing it's different when someone's like gone and then they just come back like nothing happened, instead of having a reintegration process. That's not what you asked me, but I added 1 and 2. Was that helpful?
No, and I appreciate the clarifying the language as well, because as you can tell, we are not fluent here, and we appreciate you helping us to understand better. So we did have a question in here too about the circle that you described, and I can't recall if you said it was already underway or in development around people who identify as white, who might participate in that, what would be kind of the framing of that?
Yeah, it's developing. I can actually send you all a flyer once we have that. It would likely be weekly or a bi-weekly group, just like our other circles. Most of our circles are bi-weekly or a weekly group. So I can share that flyer, and it would be through Zoom. So you just have a registration link, and it would be a recurring registration link. So there's that. And then there's the other piece, not the same, but similar. So I co-manage an organization called Coming to the Table. Have folks heard of Coming to the Table before?
Some of us have, I know, yeah.
So Coming to the Table brings together the descendants of those who were enslaved and enslavers to think about a just and truthful society. There's more to that, and trauma healing and restorative practices grounds that. Coincidentally, synchronicity, Coming to the Table is now a program of Our Joy. I was engaged with these organizations at different times, but now Coming to the Table is a program of Our Joy. And we have about 45 local groups in different areas. And of course, they're all now meeting virtually. There is a San Francisco Bay Area group called Welcome to the Table. And I can send you the links for that so you can send it out to folks. If you're interested in engaging in circle around particularly issues around race and like restorative justice, that could be a group that you could also attend.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I'm sure some folks here haven't heard of that and would be interested. And some of us encountered it a little bit in that series that I mentioned last fall. So one thing that we kind of wrestled with as we were trying to understand a little bit more about restorative justice practices and kind of the starting point of it was this question of sort of truth telling and saying your say from the perspective of somebody in the middle of, as you said, a conflict or a harm, or which are not the same, or just a disagreement. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of how that is a component of the process of making people or community more whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I think truth telling gets us on a path to repair in any sense, no matter what we're telling the truth about. I think what makes restorative justice different in how we, in the contemporary times, because we know it will look different in our indigenous ways and teachings, I think that's important to name, is that as a part of each process, even conflict and harm circles, or even reentry circles and welcome circles, you talk about values and agreements. And often it's like, I go to a restorative justice space, so I can make an assumption that we all define restorative justice the same. And I can also make an assumption that we all have the same values because we're all in the same space. And the reality is that we don't. And so we create space to name our values and our agreements. And so in a conflict circle, that really helps to ground the process so that folks feel safe enough and brave enough to be able to tell the truth. And also, it's not my work as a holder of space, not facilitate as a holder of space, to verify what someone's truth is. And I think so many times I've been in space where someone will say, I feel like they're not authentic or genuine. But whether that person is authentic or genuine is not, in some ways, my business, right? Like, that's their own work. We are here to work on that. And it harms them in some ways less than it harms me. Like, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact. It does have an impact on me because we're in community, but maybe they're not there yet. Maybe I can be better holder of space so that someone feels like they can tell even more of their truth. And so there's always a kind of agreements and values realm. In a conflict circle, we also prep. So someone would never come and say, we want to do a conflict circle, and I would bring them together. So there's also prep. Like I said, I've prepped people for over 6 hours, and sometimes the circles never happen. To really ask those questions like, what happened in the moment, right? you have our brain thinking to protect, right? So our emotions are high, you're clouded. And it's not the same for everyone, of course, might have a totally different perspective of what happened after one's cooled down, calmed down, or even in hindsight, right? So asking those questions, what happened? What are your needs? Because sometimes it's even easy to talk about what happened, and then to ask the question of like, what are your needs? What can make this right? And so in that context, it really is about creating the foundational element and doing the prep work beforehand. Of course, it looks different when we talk about applying restorative justice to things like truth-telling processes, right? And as we're exploring that for the United States, and there are over 200 truth commissions that are popping up all across the country right now, one of the questions we've talked a lot about is, what is a truth that hasn't been told, right? So, we talk about enslavement, and that is important and critical for us to talk about. And there are many communities where so many stories have not been shared. So I think about a commission that I served on in Elaine, Arkansas. We talk a lot about Little Rock. And Elaine, Arkansas, I learned so much about the significant history of that. And next piece I'm going to share is heavy, so I want to preface that. And also about the massacres, the lynchings that happened in the center of Elaine, Arkansas for the community to see. And how when I was on that commission, I vowed to take that story forth. So many people shared about that being the first time that they ever got to share what happened and the impact of that generations to come. Even if they were not alive, how that impacted their family and how stories were told, or how people of African descent in the community were treated and never told their truth. So sometimes, folks will say, I know the story of enslavement, and here are all these ripples that exist today that there continues to be a denial of. So even sometimes asking the question of what truth needs to be told, and also who needs to tell it, right? Like, there are incredible folks working in colleges and universities doing all this research, and they might not be the people that need to tell the truth, right? Because their voices are often heard and they have a lot of visibility. And so also just what truth needs to be told. And then now let's talk about repair. Reparations is a part of that, but is reparations just monetary? Let's create a space where we discuss what that looks like, and the expansiveness of repair. I'm going to end there before I get a little preachy.
We appreciate good preaching, so thank you for that. A question. So this, I'm going to convey this question. Well, you're maybe smiling at the one about the politics. Do you want to speak to that? Go. If you have comments about the political and ideological divides, and whether any of the tools of communication and restoration fit there, we'd be happy to hear them. And then I'll ask you mine.
Yeah, I don't think I will name, because I just feel like I have to. I don't think I would use that language of pro-Trump and anti-Trump people. But in terms of thinking about the political divide, I've seen it happen in a lot of spaces. I think as someone who grew up as an organizer, an angry organizer, had a lot of feelings, would probably physically want to fight people down to the death to convince that racism exists. I've stopped that. Like, it exists. This country and many other countries have been, founded uncolonized and have been colonized. And like, it's fact, it is what it is. And so I think for me, when I think about restorative justice across through the kind of political divide, it is about creating a container for people to share. I've stopped talking so much, although I'm talking a lot right now, and creating space to listen. That while race is not real, racism is. And so folks have constructed identities around what it means to be called white, what it means to be called Black, what it means to be called this, what it means to be called that. And sometimes that is, I've found, as someone who is not white and not of European descent, it is a awakening of all that someone's known and all of the ways that someone's seen themselves. So I can check someone and hold them accountable, and I can be compassionate to the shattering of a reality, the shattering of an identity, right? And so when I think about across the political divide, it is really creating space to listen, unless it comes at the extent of one's own safety. I will name that. And so the way that's shown up, In a lot of the state-sponsored violence and murders of Black and brown people by police, through the mayor's office, RJoy and other practitioners have been called in, usually to hold circle space. And we don't know who's gonna show up. And there are moments where people have shown up intentionally to disrupt the space because they have a different view of what is happening and what actually took place. And while it has been disruptive, it once again makes visible some of the things that people thought no longer existed. Some of the realities of what people thought no longer existed. So the visibility of that. And I think it also created space for community to really think about, like, what does a safe community mean? No, mama, no. Danger. I'm just trying to protect you. What does a safe community mean and a safe community look like? So I think, in short, the answer is yes, this process could be used for that. I think a lot of times if you're intentionally bringing people together for that, it takes a lot of prep. I've done some of that work in places like Virginia. That was really hard. The language informs how we see it. I think the kind of pro and anti language already sets a foundation for how people are going to show up in space. And that also, folks don't always see themselves that way. So I think creating space for people to really share is something that's important. And I think as a holder of space, not like doing the best you can, but also not trying to convince or change or make someone adopt your own beliefs. Often a lot of the transformative work that happens, I don't see it. You know, I've had people email me like 3 to 5 years later that honestly was like, this is BS and this circle sucks. And now they're implementing restorative justice in their organization or corporation. So I think the short answer is yes, it can happen. I've seen people across political divides and many more things than that have some tough conversations and still leave the table without making each other disposable.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great way to sum it up. And I will just say, for the benefit of folks in the group, the National Episcopal Church also, Bishop Curry has recently released some suggestions about how to have conversations across divide. And I can't remember the 4 questions, but one of them is, where does it hurt? And, you know, to ask that of people who maybe don't think about everything the same way you think about it is not a bad starting place for listening, right?
And I would encourage someone to also attend a coming to the table meeting if you want to, or look it up. Because, you know, everyone's coming to the table, but also still has like different perspectives. We all don't agree on the same thing. And so there are many reasons people come to the table. So I think that's a place where you examine things really, really up close when we're talking about descendants and some of those things that we have to work through in order to heal.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we've gone through most of our questions. I wonder, Jodie, if you'd like to sort of sum up. I have the sense, I don't know how I'm intuiting this, but it might be almost bedtime at your house. So I wonder if there's any way that you might want to sum up or anything you really want to remind us of. And I guess, you know, before you say that, I just what's really sticking with me is shame the act, not the person. And again, to me, that really includes so much about the accountability and yet the faithfulness to people's humanity that we want to try to keep, even when especially when it's hard, maybe. So.
Yeah, I think I would thank you for that. I would just say thank you all for inviting me tonight, and thank you for your grace as well with baby Cielo. Which is a very active one that climbs everything. I'm a new mom, so thank you all for that. I think that, you know, the piece I would say is my intention tonight wasn't to convince you to, you know, be a leader in restorative justice. I think it's really to name that I believe in order for healing to happen, I think around historical harms and what is presenting ourselves today of a dual pandemic of continued state-sponsored violence and COVID-19, that we must get proximate even through the screens and face some truths to think about what does a free world look like, what does a liberated and just society look like, and how I believe I've been led here through my faith, that I would love to do other things. I would love to be a dancer, design clothing, and Jesus is telling me to do something else. And so I think for me personally, I've been led to this place as a person of faith. And so just thank you all, I think, for holding the space with me tonight. What we can do you can get involved in restorative justice. There are many resources that are online. For sure, so many incredible videos of young people that I love in my community as well as in Chicago. I can also share the resources on the RJoy website. And we also have free community trainings that happen for folks throughout Alameda County. So you can also attend those trainings. And there are about 2 trainings, about 8 hours combined, 4 hours on one and 4 hours on another day, as well as many community events that we have that are open and that are free. So I can share some information with you all about that so that you can get connected if you want to.
So a great starting point, I think, is the RJoy website. But yes, it would be great, Jodie, if you would follow up with any resources or links that you'd like us to share. We'll be happy to put those out to everybody. You're getting a lot of appreciative chat feedback. And I just, want to, on behalf of the group and St. Anselm's, really want to give my deep thanks to you for taking time to be with us, for the work that you're doing and that RJoy is doing. And again, acknowledging the many demands I'm sure you face professionally and as a parent, and knowing that it's hard to carve out time like this at night. So
can I add one more appreciation?
Yes.
I think a lot of appreciation to John as well for reaching out and connecting. We had an incredible conversation. I was like, yes, I want to do this. And unfortunately, it couldn't be, but thank you so much just for reaching out and connecting. I definitely want to uplift that. I felt really grounded in that conversation. And I think that said, okay, this is a community that you want to be in space with. So thank you.
We have a pretty cool rector who we'll hear from in just a minute or two. I need to make a plug, though, to all of you for the rest of this series, because Jodie has been a fantastic speaker, and we have more fantastic speakers coming up these next 3 weeks. Next week, we're going to have with us Leonard Rubio, who's a formerly incarcerated man, spent a number of years in San Quentin. Now he leads a nonprofit that supports restorative circles in many California prisons. He has just an amazing personal story, as well as does organizational work that I really think people will find inspiring. So I hope that many of you can be with us. If you think you know somebody who would benefit from that, or would like to see the recording that somehow we're going to clean up and put on our website from tonight, be in touch with me or with Kathy Whitkay at the St. Anselm's office, and we'll get you in the communications going forward. And the other thing is, we always have just fantastically bright, well-connected people who participate in this. So if any of the rest of you know resources that you want to offer up and share with the group, also feel free to send that to me, and we'll try to package it up and share some resources toward the end of this series. So big thanks, Jodie, virtual applause, hand clicking. And I think Father John was going to graciously dismiss us tonight.
Well, again, I just reiterate the thanks, Jodie. You just, how you can multitask like that and not miss a beat is beyond me. And you didn't speak too fast. You gave us wonderful information, and thank you so much. So the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, Jesus' last words on the cross were to forgive those who had persecuted him because they did not know what they were doing. And we have been informed of the work that Jodie and RJoy are doing with youth who have done things that they didn't realize the impact of what they were doing. We thank you for the work of RJoy. We thank you for the ministry of Jodie that is bringing into the kingdom of man, the kingdom of God, and the vision of Jesus, so that those who have committed acts will not be defined by them. The work they do is a manifestation of your love in the world. We ask that as we go forth from this meeting, we may consider how we too may be a part of that healing love and restore your creation to the justice and the love that you envisioned for it when you created us. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. Thank you again, everybody. Questions or feedback is welcome, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you all. Have a good night. Be well.
Thank you, Jodie.
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.